It's easy to look around and notice everything wrong in your city. In this podcast by Every Neighborhood Partnership, join Grace and Andrew as they invite friends, activists, pastors, leaders, and city workers to discover what's good in the neighborhood. Join us for insightful conversations that will encourage you to see your city and its people in a new way. On this episode of What's Good in the Neighborhood, Andrew and I get the opportunity to chat with Hyun. Drew is the pastor of Hope Church NYC in Manhattan and is the executive director of Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, an organization that aims to transform church culture throughout the multiplication of deeply changed pastors and leaders. This conversation is so rich. We get to chat about what it means to look at our inner lives. Drew gives us a little bit of history on how he became a leader and a pastor and be able to work through his own processes of this Christian life, which in his words are beautiful, disappointing, and hopeful. You'll also get to hear us have some conversations around conflict, resolution, and some encouragement for leaders. So stick with us.
Well, welcome to this episode of What's Good in the Neighborhood. Grace, good to have you here.
Hi, Andrew. How's it going?
I'm feeling great. Weather's beautiful. It's the like only perfect season in Fresno where you're like, it's not burning, wind's blowing. It's beautiful. So a lot of sports and playing with my kids.
Yes. It's also, though, at that scary point where like I'm still looking at the weather app, like it's coming.
Don't get under.
Yeah, it's not yet. So yeah, it's a good time to enjoy.
Well, we are continuing our series on soul care and leadership. And as we started to think about, that bucket of work and who's done a lot of work paving the way for, I think, so many leaders across the United States and even globally, the crew and the formation of emotionally healthy discipleship and spirituality is entering a new phase. And Drew is the pastor. He's over at Hope Church in New York City and is going to be leading this work in this coming new season. Drew's agreed to be on the podcast, talk through, how God has shaped him, how he came to this moment, and, where are we going? And so super glad to have you on the podcast, Drew. And Grace also knows you from a little thing called Sea Rock.
Yep. Just got to listen to Drew the last 2 times I've been out to New York. And I think what struck me was, and I'm really excited that you'll be able to share your story here in a minute, Drew, but just this moment of basically a fork in the road of I could go this way as a pastor or I could go this way, which has been really encouraging to myself too in my own leadership. So thanks, Drew, for coming on.
Yeah, no, honor to be here, guys, and thank you for having me. By the way, what temperature is it uncomfortable in Fresno? What?
We can reach the last summer we had a month where it was over 100 every single day.
Wow.
So 102 to 114, and just at that temperature, it doesn't drop below 80 at night, and you're just like this.
Yeah.
It's not great.
Yeah.
It's not great.
Wow.
Time to leave.
So we're in the high 80s this week, and we're like, this is beautiful. This is good.
Today's 75.
Yeah, we're hanging. But I'm getting scared.
Got it.
Yeah. Drew, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to be pastoring in Manhattan? And also what brought you to as executive director of Emotionally Healthy Discipleship?
Yeah, I'd probably have to go way back. I actually grew up in California, in Los Angeles. And then I went to university up in Berkeley, California. And so I have some dear friends also from the Fresno area. So, And so we actually, I say we, my twin brother and I, we were both graduating together from Berkeley. And during that spring break of my senior year of college, I was trying to discern what I was going to do. We had helped start a church when I was in college, and there was the opportunity to actually stay on at that church and be the college pastor. By that point, I knew that I wanted to go into vocational ministry. There was also an opportunity to get a scholarship to go to Israel for a year. Or there was the opportunity. There was an organization that the previous summer between my junior and senior year that works in the inner city of New York. And what's interesting is back then, this was summer of 2000. When people would think of urban ministry, generally people thought urban ministry is we're going to go work in the hood. Whereas, I think nowadays, I think with Tim Keller, he's very much popularized kind of a notion of urban ministry that's about social and cultural renewal.
We come from the Christian community development, John
Yeah,
Perkins
that's right.
lens, right? So
Yes.
it's the grittiness of like, this is not sexy ministry.
Yeah, no, totally. And so you guys very well versed. And so CCDA was definitely the summer between the summer of 2000 was when I really experienced the power of doing kind of local neighborhood ministry, especially in under-resourced neighborhoods. And so the director of that organization, he actually recommended, he said, hey, there's this church in New York City that I think you would absolutely love. And because of their work with the poor. And so that church happened to be New Life Fellowship, where Pete Scazzero was the founding pastor. Now, this was before Pete had written anything around emotionally healthy discipleship or spirituality. They were simply known as a church that was incredibly diverse, had a very international feel to it, and that had started their own community development corporation. And so here I was entering this church thinking, okay, I'm going to learn how to do ministry in a context in which we're serving the needs of the urban poor. And in addition to that, reaching an international community right in the heart of Queens. And little did I know, I remember my first internship meeting at New Life when I joined in the fall of 2001. One of the first exercises was, hey, draw a picture of your family of origin, imagining you at the age of 9. And I was like, what kind of heresy is this? Like, what are we doing here? And I thought I came here to learn how to preach and to do real ministry. And here I was actually getting an invitation into a deeper form of discipleship of the way that gospel truth could actually begin to impact, the hidden areas of my life. And so thus began my journey at New Life Fellowship.
For people that
And
don't
then,
know or haven't been through the courses or some of the ideas, like why in the world would you draw out a family tree, and like what
yeah.
what is that about?
Yeah. And one of the big principles in emotional healthy discipleship is that my family of origin often has shaped me in a certain kind of way and has likely been one of the most powerful forces to shape me. But kind of like Jesus when he talks about leaving your father and your mother and your brothers and sisters into joining a new family of Jesus, that part of discipleship is actually leaving some of, again, the sinful patterns of my family of origin and living into the new family of Jesus and the way of Jesus. As and Paul writes about in the book of Galatians about not being orphans, but becoming heirs and sons and daughters who get to cry out, Abba, Father. And in many ways, that exercise was an exercise for me to begin to relive some of the deepest wounds and the ways that I had been shaped by my family of origin that had ended up shaping the way I lived my life. And even though I was outwardly a Christian and I would say these things, but in many ways, when it came down to the way that I did relationships, the way that I did conflict, the way that I did leadership, the way that I just did kind of navigating my inner world, the way that I looked at race and class, like more of it was not shaped by the new family of Jesus, but it was shaped by my family of origin. And so that exercise then was like the first time where someone was inviting me to actually apply the truth of the scriptures into my life, including into, some of the deepest wounds that I have around my family of origin. And so that whole journey is what led me. So here I was at New Life Fellowship, not realizing that I had also walked into what would eventually become the church that was the birthplace of emotionally healthy discipleship. And Pete and Jerry Scazzero, who are the authors and founders of the movement, they had been through their own crisis 5 years prior. And if people aren't familiar with their story, they were part of this growing dynamic church that was serving the needs of the poor, reaching an international group. and yet inwardly their souls were shrinking. They were in constant conflict and exhausted from ministry. And Jerry Scazzaro ended up quitting the church and saying, Pete, I love you, but I don't respect your leadership. And I think this church isn't living out what it was meant to live out. And so she said, at least if I start going into a different church, you can have the kids for, on the weekend and things like that. And so that's what kind of spurred on a real kind of moment of awakening for them, where they ended up getting help and the resources that they needed. And what they realized was that in many ways, the ways that people have done discipleship and the ways that they had been trained, Pete went to Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. He was on staff with InterVarsity. He had also kind of experienced the power of the Holy Spirit through kind of the Jesus movement and kind of the neo-charismatic movement that had awakened. So they had all these tools when it came to like the best that evangelicalism had to offer related to transformation. And he realized it did not go deep enough, because what had shaped his workaholism, what had shaped so many of the patterns of being conflict avoidant in his marriage, even though he had written books and Bible studies and led and preached and, pioneered this growing church, at the end of the day, his own wife did not feel loved by him. And here Jesus is saying the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with everything and to love your neighbors yourself. And his very wife, didn't feel loved by him. And so in many ways, that's what led to now what's birthed this movement called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, which is essentially a discipleship that goes beneath the surface, that not only confronts our family of origin, but also confronts some of our deepest pains and wounds. And how do we bring that to God in such an honest and raw way and allow God to transform that? And the second part is just to slow down spirituality, to actually draw from the deep well of monastic spirituality, monastic being kind of the tradition of people who fled to the desert to seek a life of prayer, and hearing from God against and over and against the excesses of the ways of the world that the church had been co-opted in. So that's a bit of a summary of emotional healthy discipleship. But that was my introduction. Was
Yeah.
Providentially being invited into this church as an intern, and then I would end up staying at that church for the next 10 years. Grew in leadership there, and then in 2012, my wife and I ended up starting a church in New York City. The first location was actually in Astoria, Queens. And then the church that we ended up starting in Manhattan, where we're now the pastors of, was in 2015. So that's how we ended up starting Hope. And then Pete and I have remained in touch. We've gone through our own ups and downs for the last 24 years. And then I recently have stepped in as the executive director and kind of like the incoming president of the organization.
Ever wondered what makes your neighborhood unique, or how the history of your city shapes the places you love today? Well, now you can explore the story of Fresno like never before, right from your car using the VoiceMap app. Introducing the Every Neighborhood Partnership Drive Tour, a self-guided audio tour that brings your community's history, landmarks, and stories to life. As you drive through local streets, EMP's Drive Tour will guide you with fascinating insights into the people, places, and events that have shaped your neighborhood. Whether you're discovering hidden gems, learning about community activism, or simply enjoying a fresh perspective on familiar places, this tour is a great way to connect with Fresno in a whole new way. So, what are you waiting for? Tap into the Every Neighborhood Partnership Drive Tour today on VoiceMap and get to know your community like never before. Download the VoiceMap app, search for the Every Neighborhood Partnership Tour, and start exploring now. Fresno's story is waiting to be discovered.
At Every Neighborhood Partnership, we believe that strong, vibrant communities start with engaged and empowered residents. To make that happen, we need your help. Our mission is to connect neighbors, create opportunities for local leadership, and transform neighborhoods through education, collaboration, and advocacy. Every dollar you donate goes directly to supporting programs that make a real difference. Whether it's providing land use education, elementary literacy mentoring, or healthy spaces to help kids and our families grow. When you donate to EMP, you're not just giving money, you're investing in a future where every neighborhood in Fresno has the tools and resources it needs to thrive. Your contribution, whether big or small, ensures that our communities have a seat at the table in the decisions that affect them most. So if you believe in seeing students excel, our community members healthy and whole, and our neighborhoods thriving, we invite you to make a donation today. Just visit everyneighborhood.org or tap the link in the show notes to give. Your support helps develop the next generation of leaders like Fresno depends on it. Donate now to Every Neighborhood Partnership.
I wish we had time to get into all the intricacies of what led you to hope, because that is such a sweet story. But I would love for us to use what you just shared as your foundation, not only of Emotionally Healthy, but then also starting Hope. When you, now as you're overseeing the organization and even as you pastor, and a little fun fact is that what I understand is that Drew's kind of known as pastor of pastors in New York, just a dear friend to so many leaders in the city. What is the importance for a leader in nonprofit or as a pastor to take on the hard work of doing that deeper discipleship that you're talking about, going back to your 9-year-old self? What is the importance of that awareness of your emotional health?
Yeah, we often have this saying, and it really comes from this theme throughout the scriptures. In John 15, when obviously the invitation to abide and to remain tethered to the vine. And we have this saying, we say, as goes the leader, so goes the church. And as goes the nonprofit leader, so goes the nonprofit. As goes the youth minister, so goes the youth ministry. And in other words, so much of ministry is dependent on who we are, which is why Jesus says, remain in me. John 15, so much of it is about abiding. But if I'm not abiding, then what ends up happening is kind of like a branch that is untethered to the vine. Eventually I wither and die. And, then Jesus talks about even more than that, right? Like throwing out those branches. And I think there's a way of doing ministry often today, or a way of doing nonprofit leadership, where I am living on fumes and I'm trying to give people what I don't possess. And sooner or later, what ends up happening is, if I'm constantly drawing from a dry well, then I have nothing to offer people other than regurgitated sermons or things that I'm getting from other people, a secondhand spirituality that's not coming from a deep rooted inner life. Now, the reality is, there's so much content out there. I could survive for a long time. But when it comes to the hidden areas of my soul, ultimately those things leak. When it comes to what I do with my anxiety, what I do with my sadness, what I do with my anger, what I do when I'm feeling dry and I don't feel tethered to the vine. And so we often talk so much about the importance of, doing the deep work, as well as slowing down enough so that I can do the deep work. But gosh, so many of the metrics of success in our world, though, is counter to that. Because the metrics of success in the world that we live in is so outwardly driven. And it's based on numbers and growth. And nowadays, obviously in the digital age, with how things are Instagrammable or how many followers one has. And so it's almost like there's different levels or kind of measures of success in today's world that end up becoming so superficial. And I can get so caught up in that I end up getting kind of awash in a shadow mission that ends up leading me away from kind of the vine, Jesus himself. So
how do you going with that? I think I was thinking of even, my lens as the executive director here. You start just the very act of creating a chart, like you said, to be able to track some information that we need to track and know, creates the drive and the measurement that then's is that chart going up or is it going down, right? So as you've even worked on, the organization side, how do you really resist the temptation, or even be like, this is what we should measure, or this is, as a staff, I'm able to evaluate where my staff's at, right? Like, how do you create a new metric or hold the metric lightly?
Yeah, and that's a great question because on one hand, we do believe in mission and growth and strategy and being able to have like an honest look at reality. So on one hand, yes, mission and growth. In the book of Philippians, when Paul he writes about your progress in the gospel, your progress and joy in the gospel. And so there's two different aspects there, right? There's progress. There's are we pushing the ball down the field? But then there's also joy. In other words, is there a culture of, Scott McKnight wrote the book, a church called Tove. Is there a goodness to kind of how we experience things? So for us, we certainly do have those goals, those outward metrics of success when it comes to, progress. But and I think that's the key question is like, how do we begin to measure the qualitative joy, the culture that we're hoping to carry, a culture of tov, of goodness? For us, a lot of that language has come around our rule of life, because the rule of life is, again, kind of a centering document for us. And a rule of life, comes from this ancient practice of creating a framework and a structure for one's life and a community's life by which Jesus is at the center. And we often say we define success as doing what Jesus wants, uh, in Jesus' way and in Jesus' timing. And so if that's the goal, then, one of the desert fathers, Abba Moses, would say, and this was so instructive for me when we were starting a church in Manhattan. Uh, he would say, go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything, your prayer cell. And I realized, like, for example, like even in the process of planting a church, I planted right around the time when Hillsong was like blowing up like wildfire, you know. Yeah, I mean, could you imagine the comparison trap and the comparison trap of, Tim Keller and his incredible, extraordinary preaching gift? And so, like, I was so awash in. I remember the first book that my church planting coach gave me was How to Break the 200 Barrier. And I was like, oh yeah, and I read it, you know, front to back. And I actually leaned towards strategy. So I ate that stuff up and had certain goals around metrics. And so, and I think on one end, that's the gift of our tradition is this mission, we call this the Protestant missionary movement, and like, I think that's one of the gifts of our tradition is progress. Um, but that, a strong shadow ends up looming. And that strong shadow is on like, well, what about the inner life, our being before doing? And so here's what I've realized is that I naturally am going to gravitate towards business books and towards strategy books. And so as a result, like I don't, it's like one of those things where it's like, I don't quite need to work on that. um, and I don't even know if the evangelical movement, we are so good at that stuff, um, and so this is where like this again, the prophetic call is like, gosh, if I'm already awash in that kind of mentality, then I need as much help as I can get to be cultivating my prayer life, taking inventory of my internal life and the dynamics within our own internal team. And so for us, that's again, it's shaped around a rule of life of who we aspire to be as a community. Our elder board has a rule of life as well. And one of the things that we're moving towards with emotional healthy discipleship is that, we have provided these resources to become a discipleship pathway for churches. And in this next season, what we're inviting churches to do, especially lead pastors and organizational leaders, is to actually commit to a rule of life that we are calling a higher kind of challenge call that's itemized around prayer, rest, relationships, and work. And so in this next season, what we're doing to impact culture is we're saying the culture of a church or organization is uh, the church or organization will not change. Yes, everyone on staff could read the book and do the course. Everyone in the church could do the course. But honestly, if the lead person and notice I'm pointing at myself. If I am living a hurried, anxiety-filled, my marriage, is just getting by, then I've kind of missed the point. And it doesn't matter if we're running the course, the culture cannot change, because who I am as the pastor and leader of this church and organization, like, invariably impacts the whole. And so this is where we're saying, like, really a rule of life is kind of this centering call for leaders to commit to. And so that's one of the ways in which we have crafted this rule of life, and we're calling. And one of the believe me, I didn't want to show this rule of life to our staff, because now they certainly will be keeping me accountable around this as well. But even our elder rule of life, that we actually, every elder meeting, that's what we start with. We start with prayer, and then our elder rule of life, like one aspect of it. And we ask ourselves, and we take inventory of how are we doing as elders of the church in this area of Sabbath keeping? And how does it impact the rest of the church community that we're in? Now, this is the first conversation that we're having at each elder meeting before we look at how's the budget going, and what new initiatives do we have going, and things like that.
Well, even as a church, you can undermine and be a counterforce against, this vision you have. You can plan all your activities, all your things, all your meetings. People are free on Sunday. Let's do that.
Yeah.
I think what I appreciate, and I see the move to, I think is so vital. I think the consumer Christianity, consumer church pushes us to lower the bar and to make it easy. And I think, like, the challenge for us is, and I think what people are wanting is to see a church that is so rooted in a different way of being, that, like, is not just another wellness trend, but like a different way of living life. And so, I think I appreciate the radicalness to say it has to start at the top. And I think it's the questions, like, even how the series came about for Grace and I think we're both, like, in this moment going, and I don't know. I've been leading here 4 years as ED. I was a pastor on staff for 9, been here for 9. How to do this well, and also do it sustainably, right? For my soul, for my family, for our community. I do want to be a leader. I think, everybody listening, like, wants to be a leader that in 20, 30 years, they finish the call. And like you said, your wife still loves you. Your husband still loves you. Those around you want to be around you. Like, your joy, that culture, that joy, the grace of God just is around you. And, like, everything else, I feel like, in our culture, everything else in my sphere pushes me for numbers, growth, next thing, right? And so, man, how to let the simplicity of a structure be the framing that guides your daily, weekly, monthly rhythm, so good.
Yeah.
That's not a question. Sorry.
No.
Grace.
No, it's so good. I wanted to dive in a little bit into, as you lead, like, the nitty-gritty of conflict, whether that be with people that you're pastoring over or your staff, and this idea of transference. Could you maybe give us a little 101 on what that looks like, at least in your world, but also what that could look like for other leaders?
Yeah.
What is transference, Drew?
I don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, and maybe you guys can elucidate on this as well. I mean,
Yeah.
transference, in my understanding of it, is this counseling term where people, especially in positions of authority, there are certain unmet expectations, wounds, kind of ways of relating to people that some people might have from their past, that ends up getting transferred to people that are figureheads of those same kinds of authority figures and that sort of thing. And so transference happens when there is these unmet expectations. And because of, again, these wounds from the past, those things end up manifesting in a relationship in another setting, for instance, like a church. And so, like for me as a lead pastor, well, I mean, I won't even take as a lead pastor. Let's take Pete Scazzaro for me, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ironic. I was just meeting with my counselor today, and we were talking about some of the dynamics of this whole, change from Pete
Mm.
handing over Emotionally Healthy Discipleship and the presidency kind of to me. And it was interesting because this is my counselor. He's been my counselor for over 20 years. And like, he knows me so well, and he's walked with me through different seasons. And Grace, probably a little part of the story of how I was, part of my story previously was the possibility of succession with Pete at New Life Fellowship, the church. And now here I am 14 years later, and we're talking about succession related to this organization. And it's interesting because as I was relating to some of my recent interactions with Pete, and I realized there were still some vestiges of my personal father wound and wanting to please my dad that 14 years ago, I was kind of ill-equipped to healthily kind of talk about those things and process those things with Pete. And now here I am 14 years later. And it was such a surprise in these sessions. Like, it was just coming up like, oh gosh, there still is that father wound that I'm growing out of. And it just happens almost without me knowing. And so I often say, well, I was on this panel once with a group of other leaders, therapists, counselors, nonprofit leaders, and it was about the referendum of leadership, like healthy leadership. That they were like, why is there so much leadership abuse in different organizations and institutions nowadays? And from my vantage point, and related to this idea of transference, I mean, even having the language of transference is so helpful because so, but I often say there's two things that I think most leaders are unaware of. Number one is I'm unaware of my shadow. And by my shadow, I'm talking about, you know, my all the sinful proclivities that come from my own woundedness, my own humanity, my own tendencies. So there is nothing like stepping into leadership than in terms of what it does for revealing someone's
Right.
shadow and weaknesses.
Yes.
And so people are well aware of, I know they've become more aware of my weaknesses more than ever. And so, but I think for most lead people, like I remember when I stepped into a lead position and, some transference was happening and people were complaining to me. And I'm like, I'm the same guy that you knew when everybody loved me. And, and they're like, no, you're not. And
You've changed.
Yeah.
I know. And I felt like I was like, no, I'm pretty sure I am. But I realized like I needed to do more work around my own weakness and shadow. So I think that's number one. But the second thing is I think I'm unaware of my power. So kind of that same way, when I said I'm the same person that I was, and that might be true. I am the same person that I was. However, the stakes are just higher when I'm in a leadership position. There's just far more transference happening. There's far more projection where people are projecting things onto me that just might not be true. And I think because of that, I mean, it's been interesting actually. My wife and I, she's the type of person who's like, she's like, I lay low and she's like, I'm uninvolved with things. But I'm like, Tina, you realize though you have power. Like when our kids ministry, when the snacks ran out or something, and she as the pastor, as the spouse, and she doesn't have an official role on our staff team. But by virtue of her being my wife and her asking, "Oh, where are the snacks today?" Like all of a sudden, it just hits much more significantly to our kids ministry team. And so even that's been an interesting conversation of like, gosh, like Tina's like, no, 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 I'm not mad at anyone. I'm just like wondering where the snacks were today. And, but it's like, yes. And by virtue of our position now, there's a certain kind of power that we wield, and that power can be leveraged for good or for ill. And so, a lot of these times when, these scandals break and things like that, a lot of times it's one of those two things. They're unaware of their shadow, or people are unaware of their power. And they're like, no, 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 you're making this way too big a deal. And it's like, no, actually, like, the power you hold is pretty significant. And so when it comes to transference, hopefully what I'm trying to do is um, trying to look at my shadow, be aware of my power, and stay a differentiated self. That word differentiation, I mean, a lot of folks have talked about that, but it's this term that we've used, is being able to be a different person, but also remain connected to another person and not reactive to that person. So, yeah, so
That was great.
yeah.
No, that's so helpful. And that was a new term for me like a year ago. And I was like, oh my goodness, what you just went through, like those two unawarenesses of
Mm-hmm.
our power and then our shadow side, like being able to walk into conflict and having those things at
Mm,
top of mind of
mm-hmm.
like, these are the two things that I hold. And they're
Mm,
probably on 10 times Zoom right now than
mm,
they would be if we were just having a conversation at the water cooler or whatever. So
yeah.
it's sweet to be able to have that understanding of yourself. Like, when I step into a conflict conversation,
Mm-hmm.
how am I presenting? But also, who do I want to be when I walk
Mm,
into this room?
yes.
Do I want to be who Jesus made me to be, and different. I love that you brought that up at the end. Like my
Mm-hmm.
full self,
Mm,
my own self, but I
yeah.
don't have to bring everything here.
Yeah.
I can be separate.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Jay Pathak, and they have some work they've done on emotionally healthy too that has been really
Mm-hmm.
helpful around differentiation. Because I think even as a leader, I've felt that where I'm like, I feel like you're really angry towards me. I don't think it's about me, but I also don't have to hold their emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I can let that emotion wash over me and
Mhm.
still see them as a human. And that has been learned from really bad me practicing it really poorly, right? Like I am very angry or this went poorly and I still can't figure out. It's like, okay, God, you have so much to teach me about how the way I handle conflict. You saw with my mom that I lived out, that I'm living out
Mhm.
again. I just, Grace was in the meeting, but it wasn't with her. But I had to go apologize to a coworker, and it's just like, I feel very defensive in that meeting. I
Mm-hmm.
felt attacked because you were simply asking questions. And I'm sorry, like I was feeling inadequate and I just need to name that. Thank you for giving me grace. I could tell you were holding it. But like that was where I was coming from. And like, that's not how I want to show up. Right. Like, but
Mm-hmm.
that, man, it's really hard. It's really hard work to do because like you said, you have to step into a shadow that, I don't know. I'm hopeful that our world is giving more space. You all are creating language for us to
Mhm.
create that space to name these things that
Mm-hmm.
probably 20, 30 years ago we just didn't. Keep asking
Yeah.
non-questions. But I do
No,
know,
that's great.
I do know, Drew, you have a book coming up, and I would love. I think the element still, even as I think about my emotional journey, like I do not know how to sit into grief to that moment. Like let's fix it and then let's move forward is my like going reaction. But you
Mm-hmm.
have a book, beautiful, disappointing, hopeful, how gratitude, grief, and grace reflect the Christian story.
Out.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's out.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So tell me, just give us like a snapshot for folks that would want to learn more. Read it, listen to it, however you can consume it. But like, where did that come from? Like, what are you trying to capture in that book?
Yeah, my attempt in the book was to actually give three simple, memorable words that describe the Christian faith and the Christian story. That if someone were to ask, what is Christianity about? I could respond and say, it's these three words. It's beautiful, it's disappointing, and it's hopeful. And relate it to the experience of anyone, whether they're not a Christian or there's someone who's coming back to faith or there's someone who's been a Christian for a while. And I think that the Christian story actually gives such a compelling vision and an explanation for life that all of us experience, whether it's beauty or disappointment, and then ultimately the hope that's found in Jesus. And so, in many ways, the book is really kind of a theology for emotionally healthy spirituality. It's a theology for seeing the world and seeing myself and seeing my relationships and giving language for how we can expect what we can expect in life, as well as how we can stay connected to Jesus in life. And so, and then the three practices of gratitude, grief, and grace are daily practices that keep me. We talked about kind of growing in self-awareness. Like for me to grow in self-awareness means getting in touch with gratitude, grief, and then lastly, grace. And so how these three practices actually help build kind of a resilient spirituality, especially in kind of the ups and downs of life that we go through. So that's why I wrote the book. And it released kind of earlier this year, and really grateful that it could be out in the world.
Well, as we land the plane with you, Drew, I would love, just as we end, like, in this moment, what's your encouragement to leaders? How can they tend to the soil of their souls amidst, like, I don't know, especially like in my generation and even younger, like Gen Z, there is like this deep hunger for change. And someone said this morning, rooted and real, like they are like something that's deeply rooted, but also a very real spirituality. What's your encouragement?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I would say, I think nowadays, I think there's been a popularization of spiritual practices and disciplines that root us in a life of prayer and contemplation and Sabbath keeping, kind of the great tradition around like staying tethered, like abiding. And then there's also the popularization of just mental health awareness, me being kind of aware of what's happening in my feelings. And I think we need to bring those two things together, because what ends up happening is if I tend to wallow too much in my feelings, then that's what ends up happening. It just leads to more cycles of anxiety, depression, and that sort of thing. And that's why I need a life of prayer. That's why I need kind of like contemplation that needs to actually address and effectuate my pain and some of what I'm going through emotionally. And then meanwhile, if I tend to be someone though who focuses on these practices, a life of contemplation, but I'm never actually allowing those parts of my life and journey, those practices and those disciplines to actually engage in kind of the deeper things of my life and journey, such as my family of origin, such as my pain, my woundedness, my own understanding of my shadow, then I end up becoming a Pharisee. And so that's why I really do think it is the combination of emotional health and contemplative spirituality, or slowed down spirituality, that really together is the kind of revolution that kind of meets the zeitgeist of the moment, where already and sometimes what happens though is these conversations, like they're almost, I think intuitively we can see them as being together, but oftentimes if they're treated as separate, then it can really lead towards not bringing about the kind of transformation that we so long for. But my desire, my hope is that really, like I mentioned, that we would be able to marry the two and have our prayer lives and the deeper journey actually start to effectuate change when it comes to our emotional health, and that our emotional health would be so lifted up through kind of the practice of prayer and contemplation.
Well, I'm super encouraged by the work you're doing, Drew. May the Lord bless you and keep you as you continue. And obviously, this is a huge change in your life and, the life of emotionally healthy discipleship. So, I can only pray the blessing that, we get more and more pastors. We continue as leaders, continue to take on this responsibility, knowing that people, lead as they go. So our prayers and blessings are with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys. And thank you for doing the work.
Thanks for tuning in. If you want to find out more about EMP, you can visit us at everyneighborhood.org or follow us at EMP Fresno. Every Neighborhood Partnership and this podcast exists to activate, equip, mobilize, and transform here in Fresno and beyond. If you liked what you've heard, please share and review what's good in the neighborhood wherever you listen. We'll see you next time.